Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight we explore not philosophers or scholars, but a group of frost-hardened voyagers who treated the North Atlantic as a routine passage, the Norse seafarers. Before we begin, if you enjoy these soothing historical journeys, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your location. It's always fascinating to see our global community. Now, get comfortable. Perhaps adjust your lighting. Maybe turn on some gentle background sound. And let's drift into tonight's exploration together. The first lesson every Norse sailor learned wasn't about bravery, navigation, or wielding weapons. It was about cold. A particular type of cold. The kind that penetrates your bones, makes your jaw ache, and convinces you that perhaps raiding warmer territories would have been a wiser career path. The North Atlantic doesn't acknowledge your ambitions, your courage, or your elaborate Norse designs. It's a steel-gray, freezing wasteland with waves resembling poor choices. And yet, for reasons understood only by the deities and sheer determination, the Norse sailed directly into it. Norse longships were engineering wonders, swift, elegant, and approximately as comfortable as a wooden box with oars. They had no enclosed quarters, no insulation, and certainly no lower deck. You stood, you froze, and you hoped your facial hair didn't fracture in the wind. It was essentially outdoor camping, if camping involved hypothermia, frostbite, and the occasional mythical sea creature. Every wave struck like a personal offense. The wind wasn't merely cold, it was a living force that despised you individually. Helmets frosted over within minutes, beards transformed into icicles, and eyebrows froze into the same expression of perpetual dismay. The ocean spray didn't splash, it pierced, and lighting a fire wasn't an option. One spark on a tar-coated ship, and congratulations, you've just created history's first Norse inferno. So they traveled without warmth, without light, and without the slightest understanding of why they thought this was a reasonable life choice. The men wrapped themselves in heavy wool cloaks, the medieval equivalent of damp towels, and pretended it provided relief. Wool smelled dreadful when wet, which it always was, but at least it concealed the despair. They lined the deck with straw to provide insulation, though insulation means nothing when your vessel is essentially a floating icebox. Sleeping was its own form of suffering. The deck served as bed, pillow, and personal ice platform. You curled up beside 20 other frozen men, all of whom smelled like anxiety and fish, and hoped nobody rolled over and stole your only dry garment. There were moments when the sea calmed, glassy, motionless, silent. That's when the real terror settled in. You'd glance around and realize you couldn't feel your fingers, your toes, or your motivation to continue. And yet, the Norse kept sailing. Not because they were courageous, not because they were fearless, but because somewhere deep within, they understood one eternal truth. Freezing to death at sea was still preferable to farming root vegetables in Scandinavia. At the end of a long day of rowing through freezing torment, you might imagine the Norse retreating to their comfortable quarters, lighting a small fire, and nestling into warm furs. You'd be mistaken. There were no quarters, no fires, no nestling. Unless you count collapsing next to a companion named Olaf, who hadn't bathed since last season. The Norse longship was a marvel of simplicity, a giant wooden freezer disguised as transportation. The deck was exposed, the wind was unrelenting, and everything, including you, was damp. The North Atlantic didn't care if you were exhausted. It wanted you exhausted and partially deceased. Sleeping arrangements were generous, in the same way that a burial container is spacious. Each man had roughly half a meter of deck space, just enough to lie flat if you didn't mind a shield pressing into your spine. There were no mattresses, no blankets, just straw scattered across the planks to absorb seawater and human misery. By morning, it froze into a crunchy layer of Norse disappointment. Their beds were their cloaks, thick wool, always wet, always smelling faintly of livestock and defeat. Some used sheepskins or furs, but those froze solid too, turning every rest period into an archaeological experiment in discomfort. You didn't lie down to rest. You negotiated with frostbite. The trick to staying alive was layering. Norse sailors wrapped themselves like human vegetables, wool tunics, cloaks, and sometimes an extra pelt if they'd raided someone wealthier and warmer. But no matter how many layers they wore, the cold always found a way in, like an uninvited guest who brought illness to supper. To make things worse, sleeping near the edge of the ship meant catching the occasional splash of salt water directly to the face. Sleeping in the middle meant being trampled by the morning rowing shift. There was no ideal spot, only slightly less terrible options. And yet they somehow slept. Not comfortably, not warmly, but from sheer exhaustion. Their bodies shut down before their minds could remember they were dying of cold. When your entire ship is constructed of wood, tar, and Norse pride, you tend to develop a healthy respect for flame. One misplaced spark, and congratulations, you've invented the world's first floating bonfire. So instead of lighting campfires on deck like typical madmen, Norse sailors used something more subtle: smoldering embers. Each crew carried what they called the dormant fire, a small metal or clay container filled with slow-burning coals buried in ash. It didn't flame, it just glowed quietly, like the last fragment of hope on a winter morning. The embers were tucked away under a clay pot or inside an iron brazier, the Norse equivalent of central heating, if central heating came with a 50% chance of burning your ship down. Losing those embers was a serious offense. It meant no fire at camp, no cooked food, and no light to keep away whatever creature was making that sound in the darkness. A skilled crewman could keep coals alive for days, blowing gently into the ash when the glow started to fade. You weren't just rowing a ship, you were babysitting a fire. At night, men would gather around the brazier, palms extended, eyes half closed, pretending it was warm. The truth? It wasn't. The thing gave off less heat than a dying candle, but it was symbolic, a reminder that somewhere in this frozen purgatory, fire still existed. The embers weren't for cooking. Nobody risked that. Meals were eaten cold or smoked long before departure. The brazier's job was purely psychological, a flicker of civilization in a world made entirely of wet wood and despair. Occasionally, the brazier would tip over in rough seas, filling the air with sparks. This was followed by several minutes of shouting, frantic stomping, and heartfelt prayers to every deity in the Norse pantheon. Miraculously, most of them lived, which only reinforced the Norse belief that Odin personally protected fools. So no, they didn't heat their ships with roaring fires or clever engineering. They kept a tiny ember alive, the most fragile, inconvenient warmth imaginable. When it came to clothing, Norse sailors had one rule: if it keeps you alive, it's fashion. Forget elegance. This was survival couture. The North Atlantic didn't care if you looked heroic. It cared whether your internal organs froze before breakfast. Every Norse outfit started with wool, thick, itchy, and perpetually damp. Wool tunics, wool trousers, wool socks, and wool cloaks. They lived inside a mobile sheep. It trapped air for warmth, absorbed water like a sponge, and smelled like a wet farm animal because it was one. Over that came animal hides: deer, bear, seal, reindeer. Basically anything that had once moved faster than a Norse sailor with a club. The hides were heavy and stiff, but they blocked the wind. Furs lined cloaks and hoods, forming what scholars now call the Norse sauna aesthetic. It was functional layering centuries before modern outdoor brands figured it out. The goal was simple: create as many barriers between your skin and the apocalypse as possible. Boots were a whole other story. Norse footwear was more concept than comfort. Leather bound with cords, stuffed with dry grass or moss for insulation. It worked surprisingly well until the grass froze, turning every step into a game of how much pain can you hide while pretending to be fearless. Colors were muted: brown, gray, maybe a little red if you just raided someone with taste. Dyes were expensive and unnecessary. Nobody cared about fashion critique when your eyebrows were frozen together. If there was one body part the Norse truly feared losing to the cold, it was their feet. Fingers were optional. You could still wield a sword with a few missing, but toes? That was serious. No one wants to raid distant lands with feet that snap like stale breadsticks. The human foot wasn't designed for the North Atlantic. It was designed for walking on Earth, not standing in frozen puddles on a wooden deck while your commander shouts poetry about honor. To fight it, they invented Norse socks. Not wool, not cotton, but grass. Dried sedge or moss packed inside their shoes like organic insulation. You'd stuff your boots full, squeeze your feet in, and hope it stayed dry for more than 10 minutes. It rarely did, but at least it gave the illusion that you were doing something productive while freezing to death. Some men smeared animal fat or tallow on their feet before putting on socks. The logic was sound. Grease repels moisture. The side effect was that the ship now smelled like a combination of seal carcass and despair. At first glance, a Norse longship looks sleek, elegant, and powerful, the very image of naval supremacy. Then you realize it's also basically a wooden ice stick with oars. It had beauty, yes, but comfort? Absolutely not. Calling it home was like calling a coffin a compact apartment. Still, the longship was a masterpiece of practical design. Every curve, every plank, every tar-sealed seam served one purpose: not sinking. And in the North Atlantic, that alone was a kind of luxury. To keep out the wind, Shipbuilders overlapped planks in what's called clinker construction, sealing every gap with tar and animal fat. It worked surprisingly well, until the sea reminded you that tar only stops water, not cold. The ocean didn't need to leak inside. It just reached through the wood and strangled your soul. To make things cozier, the Norse hung their shields along the ship's sides. The sagas tell us this was for defense, but let's be honest, half the time it was to block wind from freezing their eyeballs. At some point, probably halfway through their third frostbite, the Norse decided they deserved shelter. Not real shelter, mind you, not walls, roofs, or anything luxurious like that. Just a piece of canvas stretched over their heads so they could pretend the sky wasn't trying to eliminate them. They called it a ship tent, and it was about as effective as holding a napkin over a bonfire. Made from coarse wool or sailcloth, it draped across the longship's center, anchored by oars, shields, and pure delusion. Under this makeshift tent, 20 to 30 men huddled together, packed tighter than salted fish. They lay shoulder to shoulder, wrapped in wet cloaks, pretending to sleep while slowly marinating in each other's breath. The air inside the tent was thick with moisture, sweat, and regret. If you survived the night, it wasn't from warmth. It was from mutual body heat and a shared refusal to admit defeat. Sometimes condensation would build up on the inside of the tent until it started raining from within. The Norse called that weather. When you think of Norse feasts, you probably imagine roaring halls, roasted boars, and overflowing mead horns. But on a longship, forget that. Dinner on the open sea was basically punishment with calories. The menu never changed: cold, dry, and questionable. Cooking on deck was forbidden. Fire and wooden ships didn't mix well, unless you liked your meals served with screaming. So every Norse voyage began with weeks of pre-cooked misery: smoked fish, salted meat, and hard bread tough enough to qualify as armor. Breakfast was dried herring, washed down with a gulp of seawater by accident. Lunch was more dried herring. Dinner? If you guessed dried herring, congratulations, you could survive the North Atlantic. Fresh meat was a luxury reserved for when someone's hunting luck outperformed their frostbite. Otherwise, you gnawed on your supplies and dreamed about fire. To keep their strength, they ate fat, lots of it. Whale blubber, pork grease, even melted animal fat smeared on bread like medieval margarine. Water wasn't safe to drink. It went rancid in storage, so they relied on ale or mead. Weak enough not to eliminate you, but strong enough to make you briefly forget you were sitting in a floating freezer. Hydration by mild intoxication. The Norse way. Food was fuel, not enjoyment. You ate because you had to row another 100 miles through sleet, not because you enjoyed the subtle notes of salted despair. If warmth couldn't come from fire, the Norse found the next best thing: mead. Not because it actually worked, but because it made them care significantly less that it didn't. Mead was the Norse solution to almost every problem: cold, boredom, fear, existential dread, the sound of 20 men snoring in unison. You name it, they drank about it. Made from honey, water, and wild yeast, it was sweet, strong, and deceptively cheerful, like drinking liquid courage brewed by someone with a head injury. At sea, it was more functional. You didn't raise a horn to honor Thor. You drank directly from the barrel to forget that your boots had frozen to your feet. Mead was stored in wooden casks, carefully sealed with tar and optimism. Over time, it picked up a distinct flavor, which in historian speak means it tasted like the inside of a Norse ship. It wasn't about taste anyway. It was about pretending that the warmth in your chest wasn't just your body surrendering. There's a popular myth that alcohol warms you up. The Norse believed it completely. In truth, it just widened your blood vessels, tricking you into thinking you weren't freezing. It's the same kind of warming that happens right before frostbite. But try telling that to a crew of half-frozen berserkers with mugs in hand. A few cups in, morale rose. Men sang louder, laughed harder, and suddenly the blizzard didn't seem so terrible. When all else failed, when the fire was gone, the mead was empty, and the cold had crawled into their souls. The Norse turned to the oldest heat source known to humankind: each other. Yes, that's right. Norse survival strategy number 4 was the ancient Scandinavian art of, "Please don't perish next to me, I need your body heat." On longships, personal space didn't exist. It was everyone's warmth or everyone's funeral. At night, the crew lay shoulder to shoulder beneath their damp wool cloaks, forming one large collective disappointment. The sagas call this ship brothers. Archaeologists call it necessary. Modern people would probably call it trauma bonding. Either way, it worked. Each man was both heater and heated. If one rolled over, the others froze. If someone got up to relieve themselves, 10 curses followed him. There was no privacy, just a tangle of limbs, fur, and existential crisis. To outsiders, it might sound strange. To Norse sailors, it was routine. Warmth was warmth. Dignity be cursed. They weren't embracing for affection. They were embracing for thermodynamics. The only thing more awkward than the situation was explaining it afterward. Brotherhood wasn't forged in battle. It was forged under one damp blanket while pretending to be asleep. No one who survived that level of shared suffering ever doubted loyalty again. When you can't feel your fingers, your feet, or your will to live, there's only one thing left to do: start singing. And that's exactly what the Norse did. Music wasn't just entertainment. It was a survival mechanism. When your ship's deck was a frozen plank buffet and your beer doubled as an icicle collection, singing kept the blood moving and the madness contained. Rhythm gave warmth, structure. Harmony gave misery company. The songs were simple: chants, rowing tunes, war hymns, each one designed to make 20 men pull oars in perfect sync while pretending their joints weren't crystallizing. Some were about gods and glory, others about ale and women, and a few, no doubt, about how much they despised this exact situation. These were working songs, half melody, half grunting, timed to the rhythm of the oars. The result was haunting, primal, and occasionally off-key when someone's lips froze mid-verse. The music wasn't just to pass the time, it unified the crew. The same men who'd argued over stolen rations now harmonized like a choir of freezing psychopaths. Singing drowned out the groans of the ship, the hiss of the wind, and that quiet voice in your head whispering, "You could have stayed home." And when the storms hit, when the sea howled and the sky turned black, they sang louder, not because it helped, but because it made them feel like they had a say in the matter. For a people who worshipped gods that literally hurled lightning bolts, the Norse had one very unheroic fear: fire. Not the poetic candlelit kind, the real kind. The kind that turns your ship, your home, and your entire crew into a floating Norse barbecue. Fire was warmth, yes, but it was also treachery. You could trust ice. Ice eliminated you slowly, politely. Fire eliminated you loudly. Every Norse ship was soaked in tar, packed with timber, rope, sails, and dreams. That's why Longships never carried open flames. No torches, no bonfires, no romantic candlelight dinners for two warriors and a goat. Instead, they relied on smoldering embers, tiny, manageable, and only slightly less suicidal. Lighting a real fire mid-voyage was the kind of decision that guaranteed you'd be remembered in the sagas as a warning. It wasn't just about the ship. Fire was sacred. Back home, it lived in the hearth, tended by women, protected by gods, and treated with a reverence modern people usually reserve for technology. At sea, though, the flame belonged to no one. It became wild, dangerous, a god unchained. The Norse respected that. They feared it. They carried it in small ember boxes, whispering prayers as if to say, "Behave yourself, or we all perish." Ironically, their funeral rituals involved the one thing they avoided most. A warrior's final voyage was often a ship burning, the famous pyre on water. Death was the only time a Norse sailor willingly set a ship on fire. If the Norse had one true religion, it wasn't Odin, Thor, or Freya. It was suffering. The Norse gods got the temples, but pain got the devotion. Endurance wasn't just a virtue, it was a lifestyle. If you complained, you weren't Norse. You were an inconvenience. In Scandinavia, comfort was suspicious. Warmth made you soft. Softness made you weak. And weakness made you, well, not nod and grin back at it. So after all the ice, wind, hunger, and questionable life choices, how did the Norse keep warm without fire? The short answer, they didn't. The long answer, they cheated death through sheer arrogance. For the Norse, warmth wasn't something you had, it was something you became. They turned endurance into energy, suffering into swagger, and cold into character. They didn't need comfort, they needed challenge. Fire was for weaklings. Frostbite was just proof you'd been somewhere worth bragging about. They wrapped themselves in furs, cloaks, and denial, then called it resilience. They huddled under damp canvas and sang into the wind as if defiance itself generated heat. Maybe it did. Maybe that's why they survived, while softer men stayed home, writing poetry about warmer climates. What they lacked in temperature, they made up for in conviction. Their hearts were furnaces, powered by pride, hunger, and an unwavering belief that they were the toughest people alive. They didn't need warmth to live. They needed purpose. Every gust of wind, every frozen wave, every miserable night on the open sea reminded them who they were. People too stubborn to perish properly, to freeze quietly around you. It's inside you. Stubborn, blazing, and utterly indestructible. And that's how the Norse conquered the cold. not by escaping it, but by becoming colder than the cold itself. Sleep well, and let these ancient stories of endurance carry you gently into dreams.